I want to ask you what your thoughts on the role of the Democrats and where we are is.
Democrats have had 50 years since Roe v. Wade, half a century to codify Roe v. Wade into law. So to pass a bill guaranteeing the right to abortion across the country, they haven't. Instead, election after election, they just fundraise off it, the big bad Republican boogeyman, but then they fail to do anything to stop the big bad Republican boogeyman. They just want more and more of your money. And so, yes, it is Republicans' fault. It is the far right theocratic urge and movement that's taken over the Supreme Court that's doing this. But Republicans are doing it, and Democrats are failing to stop them from doing it. And so I think that they have a big role in this as well.
The only place I dissent, I generally agree. I'd say, perhaps Rebecca's being too charitable to Democrats, insofar as I think that I can look at Pelosi's record, and particularly Dianne Feinstein, and detect multiple points of active complicity. It's not merely the case that Democrats have failed to hold the line on reproductive rights. Wing has continued its generation-long assault. Democrats, particularly corporate Democrats, have been actively complicit. Pelosi had opportunities, for instance, to at least delay, if not derail, the nomination of Justice Amy Coney Barrett and basically put her nomination through the same treatment that Merrick Garland's had gotten before. And she affirmatively declined to do it. Today, as a matter of fact, Pelosi was in Texas stumping for Henry Cuellar, who is the last anti-choice Democrat in the House, and for party leaders to actively support incumbents who actively undermine the right to choose while mouthing support for the principle, to me, is more disingenuous. It reflects a corruption, unfortunately, and a hypocrisy.
I think like where we are seeing leadership from some political leaders is at the state level, right? You have Oregon coming out and saying it's going to create a $15 million fund for reproductive health using, federal funding. You have Connecticut passing a state law that's going to protect people from, attempts by other states to try to punish people across state lines for, seeking or providing abortions. So I think where we do see momentum and where we do see like good news is at the state and local level, where, federal leadership from the Democratic Party has been, lacking at best.
There is definitely leadership at the state level, but the concern I have is that Republicans are attempting to push through laws that would extend the jurisdiction out beyond their state. So, for example, in Idaho, there was recently a law that it's a crime to seek medical care, trans-related medical care for your trans child, and it's also a crime to cross state lines to do it. And then we had during the 1800s, certain states had outlawed slavery, but there was the Fugitive Slave Act where the states that did have slavery were allowed to go into those states, searching because their state law extended beyond their borders. So that's what I think the Republicans are pursuing right now. So even if, Governor Inslee, the governor of Washington state, said Washington is a pro-choice state, okay, great, as long as that lasts, until the Republicans find a way to make this national. But go ahead, Shahid.
Well, just to extend on your point, I think Rebecca's noting that the state momentum behind positive reforms is encouraging in those limited places, but perhaps countervailed by backlash in red states. My concern particularly is that the erosion of Roe leaves the federal judiciary entirely on the sidelines as this right-wing backlash proceeds across the states. And it basically resigns much of the country to not having access to family planning services. And that's a huge problem. It's been the case, first of all, for a generation, which leads me to another point. I think a lot of the community of advocates surrounding reproductive liberty has failed to sound the alarm over the course of the 15 years that Roe has been basically hanging by a thread. The Carhart decision in 2007 effectively overruled Roe, and I wrote that at the time. And the entire reproductive liberty community's response was, it still exists, write us checks, we'll defend it. And that's not the answer. No number of checks to the ACLU or NARAL is going to fix this. This has to be a fix through the judicial nominations route. And Democrats have been completely asleep at the switch. I spent years in the early 2000s at the American Constitution Society building a pipeline of progressive jurists for the next Democratic president to appoint. And when President Obama came into the White House, He appointed one of them. His name's Goodwin Liu. He's currently a justice of the California Supreme Court because when his federal nomination became controversial, Obama abandoned him and then ran for the hills. He basically appointed a series of prosecutors and corporate lawyers of color, called it a day, and now here we are. And this is the consequence of Democrats for decades taking their eye off the ball of judicial nominations, abdicating that arena to the right wing entirely. And this is what we get for it ultimately.